My mother was born in North Braddock, Pennsylvania in 1902. My father was born in Pleasant City, Ohio, and he was born in 1900. Well, let's start with my dad's dad, my grandfather, and his name was Michael Berilla, and he came from a town which is now called Stratka in Slovakia. But of course, when he came to the United States, it was the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The family story goes this way, that he was 19 years of age, and King Ferdinand at that time was subscribing a lot of young men for his army. So the family just thought it was good for Mike to leave town and go to the United States. So when Mike Berilla got to the United States, a 19-year-old, he went to Ellis Island. And the family story says that one incident was that someone came up to him and said his hair was too long, and if he didn't get a haircut, they'd send him back. So the gentleman asked my grandfather how much money he had, and he showed him like $1.25. And the guy said, "Oh, that's enough." So he cut my grandfather's hair. Of course, he was scammed immediately when he got here because he didn't have to have his hair cut. From there, he got on a train, and he was supposedly to go to a town called Derry, Pennsylvania, because a lot of the guys from his village were there in a boarding house, and they were all coal miners. So once again, as the story goes, he was on the train and he had a little tag around himself that said Derry, PA. The conductor forgot to look at the tag, and so my grandfather ended up in Cleveland, Ohio. And when they found that out, they put him back on the train and sent him back to Derry, Pennsylvania. But the mines were down at that time. So after several months living there, the boarding house guy said to everyone there, "The mines are opening up in Ohio." So then my grandfather and the other guys all went to a town called Byesville, Ohio, which is near Cambridge, Ohio. And as they all got some work in the mines, but if you understand at that time, they were mining coal by wheelbarrows, pick and shovel and wheelbarrows. And so my grandfather was paid for how many wheelbarrows of coal that he was able to take out of the mine. After working there for a couple of years, he had a few dollars that he was able to pay the boarding house person back in Derry, PA for his board. And he sent a few dollars back to his parents in present-day Slovakia. Being 21 years of age, he decided it was time for him to get married. So there wasn't a Catholic church in town, but a priest did come like once a month, but he had Mass at a local bakery. So Mike Berilla went to Mass, and he saw this young lady across the bakery store and So he decided to go over to this young lady's parents, and he went over to the parents and said, "I would like to marry your daughter." As the family story goes, up until that time, he never even had one word with this young lady that he took a shine to. So the parents said, "Come over here, Mary. This Mike Berilla would like to marry you." Mary was 16 years of age at that time, and so they did. They did get married, and the marriage worked because they were married for 72 years and had 10 children. They had 4 boys and 6 girls. My dad was born in Pleasant City, Ohio, but they moved when he was young, maybe 1 or 2 years of age, to Byesville. And that's where Mike and Mary Berilla, with their 10 children, lived for their whole life in Byesville, Ohio, on 10th Street. And my grandfather was a coal miner his whole life. And he lived to be his 93 years of age. And it's interesting because at that time there was if you worked in the coal mines, you ingested that coal dust to the extent that when you coughed up, you would cough up black. My grandfather lived long enough that his lungs were cleared and he was not spitting up black any longer. But at the house on 10th Street in Byesville, Ohio, you say, how did they raise 10 children? They had an extensive garden. I mean, it probably was a half acre at least, with every type of vegetable or tomato or whatever else you wanted to have in that garden. They also raised chickens and had a rather extensive chicken coop. They also had a cow. So they had milk from the cow and chickens and all of the food from their garden. And of course my grandmother would can all kinds of things so that they would have canned goods in the wintertime also. Well, Mary Kocherha was born in present-day Slovakia, of course, Austro-Hungarian Empire at that point. I don't know if she came from the same village of my grandfather, but as a little girl she was able to achieve languages, so she did speak Slovak, Ukrainian, and Polish, as well as English. So I really don't know how old she was when she came to the United States, but they did move to a town close to Byesville, Ohio, called Pleasant City, and that's where she had been there until she married my grandfather. And so as far as the Kocherha family goes, she did have a sister, and there is some extended family, of the Kocherha family, which I am not appraised of too much information concerning the Kocherhas itself. One thing I would have to say at this point that my grandfather, Mike Berilla, he did have a brother, and his name was George Berilla. And as far as I know, that on the Berilla side anyway, that George and Michael Berilla were the only two that I know of Berillas. And the Kocherhas, I know that my grandmother had a sister, and I don't know too much more about her extended family. There were my grandfather's brother came to the United States with him, and they lived in a boarding house in Massachusetts. There was another gentleman at this boarding house who said he wanted to get married to a Slovak girl. It was one of my grandmother's brothers said, if you pay the passage for my sister, she'll come from the Austro-Hungarian Empire and marry you. So my grandmother at age 16 came to the United States and went to the boarding house and took one look at this guy who said he wanted to get married to a Slovak girl, and she said, I'm not marrying him, I'm going to go back to Czechoslovakia, or the Austro-Hungarian Empire at that point. Anyway, another guy stepped up and said, would you marry me? And that was my grandfather, Mike Cadis. And she says, okay, I'll marry you. So she was 16 at that point, and I don't know how old my grandfather happened to be at that point. But they did get married, and they had 3 children who lived. Apparently my mother said that her mother had some other children but died in childbirth. But there are 3 living children. My mother had 2 brothers, Mike Cadis and a Johnny Cadis. But my grandfather, Mike Cadis, he died when he was like 43 years of age, and he was a steel worker in North Braddock, or in Braddock, Pennsylvania, at Digger Thompson Works, and but he did die when he was 43. I called her Bubba, which is a Slovak for grandmother. And I spent a lot of time with my Bubba, more so than some of my other cousins or my sister and so on. And the little bit of Slovak that I know is from my Bubba, because she did not speak English. So one of the expressions that I especially remember is, "Ja ci dam po rici." I'll give you a smack on your butt. So there are some other phrases that I could remember, but I always remember that very fondly. Ja ci dam po rici. But my Bubba, we did play a card game too. If you remember the card game called War, that we played War with the cards. And another thing that my Bubba would do is she had a wood-burning stove, and she would bake toast by putting the bread on top of the wood-burning stove until it was almost black. And it was really delicious. Charcoal, and to this day I liked burnt toast at this point. But then she would slather it with butter and jelly, and I can remember the burnt toast that my Bubba used to make me. So we did have some wonderful times together, and it was just so interesting. As a little boy, you're like a little sponge as far as languages go, And as she only spoke Slovak to me, that I would understand what she was saying, even though it was in a language that I did not really ever foster or ever really learn the language, but I do know some expressions and remember them from my Bubba. She was a very loving individual who watched over the grandkids who we all lived. There was my two cousins, Jerry and Jackie Cadis, and my sister Annette. And we played as little kids in the backyard, and the one who watched over us was our Bubba all the time. And we did do things like building tents out of the sheets that were hanging on the ropes because they always dried clothes outside, and we would make tents out of the sheets that were there. And our Bubba always was there watching us and helping us do whatever we were doing back there. She, we could say she was the most important, you were going to say, babysitter that I have ever had in my whole life.
And you were her favorite?
Favorite. Ty shumny dziewko, you're a pretty girl. Ja lubim ty, I love you. And right now, maybe some of the phrases aren't coming right to my mind, except Jacy dam policji. This is an interesting story because, like I had mentioned maybe before, that the Slovak community was a very close community of individuals. And you have to think that my mother lived in North Braddock, Pennsylvania, and my dad lived in Byesville, Ohio. So how did these two people actually meet? Well, my grandmother, her name being Kocherha, that she had some cousins and extended family, but there was one of her relatives who was getting married in a town called Trail Run, Ohio, which is right outside of Byesville. But the individual that he was marrying was from Pennsylvania, from Pittsburgh. And so because of that, my mother came from North Braddock, Pennsylvania to Trail Run, Ohio for the wedding. And my dad was at the wedding. So he took a shine to this young lady who was coming to the wedding. And actually after the wedding, what my dad did, he moved to North Braddock, Pennsylvania to pursue the love of his life. And that's where they met, in Trail Run, Ohio, at a wedding. As my dad was pursuing the love of his life, and he would visit her, and they would sit in the living room, and they would talk and chat. But my mother's mother, my grandmother, would be steps right outside surveying their courtship. Then all at once, my mother's mother, my grandmother, would come in and just say, "That's enough, it's time for you to go home." So my dad would have to leave because the evening conversation was at a close. So from those little conversations in the living room, sitting on a couch, Actually, a marriage came from that. She did go to a Catholic grade school with Dominican nuns, and she did actually get into the 6 years of education, but she could have been gone 7 years. But at that time, when she went back to school, when school was starting, one of the sisters asked her what grade she was in, and she said 6th grade, and they says, go over there. So actually she went to 6th grade twice. And after 6 years or so of schooling, her mother said, what do you want to do? Spend the rest of your life going to school? You could read and you could write. What more do you need? Now go and get a job. So she did leave school after 6 years of education. And as she said, she worked at a restaurant and cleaning pots and pans, and at an early age. Now my father, of course, he grew up in Byesville, Ohio, and they had a grade school there, Catholic school. And the pastor at that point of the Catholic school and the church, he was transferred, and his name was Father Hughes at that point. And he said to my dad, he said, if you want to continue your education where I'm going, they have a school, so you could come and stay with me. So actually he lived with Father Hayes as he finished his 8th grade, and he lived in Maynard, Ohio. After that, he did end up going to Cleveland and becoming a skilled machinist, which really worked out well for him because he really spent the majority of his professional life as a skilled machinist working in the Westinghouse in East Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania.